Chapter 28, from 1824 to 1836, Section 17. The recall of Arthur, long anticipated by his enemies, at length arrived. Some months before, he had been informed by the Secretary of State that, having continued him in his government for the unusual period of 12 years, the Crown intended to name his successor. On the recommendation of Mr. Huskisson, the duration of an ordinary government was limited to 6 years. Special reasons withdrew Van Diemen's Land from the operation of this rule. The ministerial changes at the seat of empire left Arthur's influence unimpaired. The variations of national policy rarely reached his sphere. Unwelcome orders he managed to modify or evade. The difficult nature of his duties, the distance of his government from supervision, and the weakness of the free population enabled him to assume and maintain for many years a discretion all but unlimited. The state of the colony on his arrival has been already noticed. The measures he adopted to coerce and control the convict population and to subdue the aborigines will be found in the second volume of this history. He repressed the outrages of the lawless and restored comparative tranquility. Under his auspices, the chief town, which he found consisting of a few frail dwellings, assumed the aspect of a commercial city. Many he received in chains were established in social happiness. Many immigrants who arrived with slender resources had risen to opulence. A series of 47 statistical tables, prepared by the colonial secretary, his nephew, exhibit a progress then almost unexampled. In 1836, the revenue had increased from £16,866 to £106,639. The imports from £62,000 to £583,646. The exports from £14,500 to £320,679. Mills from 5 to 47. Colonial vessels from 1 to 71. Churches from 4 to 18. The population had risen from 12,000 to 40,000. And every branch of public and private enterprise exhibited the same general aspect. It would be absurd to ascribe to Arthur even the main credit of these results. They were the effect of that spirit of industry which ever characterizes the native of Great Britain, and which nothing can wholly extinguish. Nor was this prosperity without alloy. The unproductive improvement encouraged was sometimes unhealthy. The settlers were deeply involved. The valuation of property was raised beyond reasonable calculation. The pleasing delusion was cherished by the members of the government, whose official and private interests concurred to dupe them. Happy were they who sold. Arthur left many who, acquiring his favor by the extent of their outlay and the vigor of their enterprise, were laden with debts from which they never recovered, and a prey to perpetual solicitude. The great demand for sheep and cattle, created by the establishment of new colonies, gave a temporary respite. Flocks were sold at £2 per head and were purchased in large quantities. These ameliorations were only transient, and the wide regions open to adventure lessened the worth of those properties which had been valued by the farms of Great Britain, not the unpeopled wilds of New Holland. A just estimate of Arthur's administration must include all the peculiarities of his position and the complicated interests he held in trust, whether they relate to the imperial government, the free, or the bond. The measures best for the colony were not always compatible with the design of its establishment. Nor must we forget that in surveying the past we have lights which rarely attend the present. That much which experience may amend, it is not possible for wisdom to foresee. The primary object of the Crown in colonizing this island was accepted by this governor as the chief aim of his policy. The settlement of free men he considered but subsidiary to the control and reform of the transported offender. Their claims, their duties, and their political rights were, in his view, determined by their peculiar position. They were auxiliaries hired by royal bounties to cooperate with the great machinery of punishment and reformation. As the representative of the Crown, he stood off from the colonists in their sympathies and ultimate views. Employed not to build up a free community of Englishmen, but to hold in check the criminality of an empire, with him the settlement was an institution requisite to the effective execution of penal laws. Such he found it. Such he desired to mold its growth and to prolong its destination. Thus, except in the capacity of employers, He regretted the arrival of free men and warned the ministers of the crown that by their encouragement of emigration, they were destroying the value of bond labour, the dependence of the settlers, and the adaptation of the island for the purposes of a prison. Thus, in his official correspondence with colonists on subjects of a political nature, Arthur always avowed hostility to liberal ideas and scoffed at their solicitude for the common rights of English people. While the opposition could avail, he resisted the liberty of the press, trial by jury, and open discussion of legislative measures. His remarks were often in a tone austere and reproving, nor did he think himself obliged to preserve that dignified complacence which softens the differences of political life. The settlers were expected to stay at home, to keep their servants in custody, to denounce their infractions of penal rule, and as the materials of prison discipline, so they were denominated, to carry out a judicial sentence. They knew before they came they must sacrifice British rights, and with the political or social influence of transportation beyond their own fences, they had no concern. As an officer of the army, the profession of Arthur was not unfavourable to the main purpose he avowed. The process he conducted was, of necessity, harsh and imperative. In the selection of instruments, he preferred military men. They were without colonial scruples, and when the government was unconcerned, perhaps, without partiality. They were deficient in legal knowledge, and as magistrates sometimes overlooked the material facts, but they despised the reproaches of the press and the censures of civilians. In the course of his administration, Arthur had most places at his temporary disposal. He filled them, wherever possible, with his friends, and he left his nephews in the highest appointments within their professional capacity. Arthur drew out a minute detail of official subordination. The duties prescribed for his officers were defined with laboured exactness, and the reins of control met in his hands. Everything was referred to himself, and his instructions were definite and generally irrevocable. Many persons appointed by the Crown were dismissed or thrown off by his contrivance. Accident placed many offices in his provisional gift. Baxter, a judge-elect, Gellibrand, an attorney-general, Faraday, a sheriff, Thomas, a treasurer, Burnet, a colonial secretary, O'Farrell, a collector of customs, and many in lower station relinquished or lost their appointments by the determination of his inflexible and unflinching will. The forfeiture was sometimes obviously just, but it was a maxim of his government to fill the departments with persons who knew no patronage except his own. Among them were candidates for the same gifts, who looked for fortunes beyond the limits of their duties. They cultivated farms, became competitors for prisoner labour, and speculators in commerce. The Supreme Court and the newspapers were often occupied by their recriminations. Sometimes they exchanged challenges and sometimes rights. The colonists in opposition saw, not without some gratification, dissensions which seemed to weaken the common enemy, and the press was often enriched by the malice of official pens. Many were, however, too wise to quarrel. Their quiet industry enabled them to combine their public and private employments without scandal and with success. They were, indeed, accused of peculation, but specific charges were generally rebutted, and can now only be noticed as a rumour and dismissed as detraction. The officers trained under Arthur acquired his tact and imbibed his spirit. The least deemed himself something superior to the richest trader or the most enterprising colonist. The subdivisions among themselves were minute and rigorously enforced. They were, however, subject to vicissitudes. Those who lost their appointments furnished the material of libels, reported the peculations and duplicity of their late colleagues, and often became distinguished for their patriotism. The patronage permitted to Arthur was enormous. To a large extent he was the almoner of the Crown. Thus disaffection became highly penal. A quarrel with a magistrate, or a friendly intercourse with persons under a ban, exposed the delinquent to serious pecuniary loss. These considerations were avowed. The dread of injury made the timid servile and corrupted private intercourse. A secret influence pervaded every rank. Society was embittered by suspicions and the dread of denunciation, and had not the growth of population decreased the comparative power of the government, or had its original plan been perpetuated, it must have formed a community of slanderers and slaves. The intentions of the governor, however just, could not save him from the falsehood of spies, and thus the perpetration of wrong. It was early announced that opponents would be crushed. The extent of the crushing system was greatly exaggerated, and even the course of good government was commonly ascribed by the sufferer to official enmity and avarice. The industry of Colonel Arthur was constant. His attention to the details of his government and his perseverance as a despatch writer were universally admitted. A large proportion of his time he spent in his office and toiled with an assiduity which would have been fatal to ordinary men. It was commonly stated that he was not very accessible, but he willingly heard those whose education and habits qualified them to suggest. Persons of every rank were admitted to an audience on a slight pretense. He was quick in estimating the characters and capacities of all who approached him. The executive council was useful to Arthur without obstructing his measures. When he resolved on a project, he would nominate a board and obtain its sanction. When his private views were opposed to his instructions, he affected impartiality and seemed to yield rather than to guide. These artifices were well understood, but the colony often approved the object and admired the ingenuity of its execution. A new colonial minister, in the hurry of his office, gladly surrendered to the governor's judgment a question often beyond his comprehension, and which to resist it was necessary to understand. Thus it was ordered to execute public works by contract instead of the gangs, to levy a tax on convict labour, to retain men 7 years in chains. Boards, or commissions, which gave him the aspect of a mediator or judge, advised him to postpone and quash the disagreeable order or restriction. Thus, during his government, his influence was paramount, and inferior functionaries were satellites who obeyed his impulse or were driven from their spheres. The Chief Justice alone could pretend to independence. By his seat in both councils, he possessed a voice in the enactment and administration of the laws. A subject of continual suspicion and complaint, and really dangerous whenever the government was a party. The Chief Justice ultimately resigned his seat in the Executive Council in 1835. The Secretary of State had declared in Parliament that legislative and executive offices were incompatible with the proper functions of a judge. The great works of Arthur were attributed by his opponents to sinister motives. Those most frequently mentioned were the new wharf at Hobart Town, the road to Richmond, and the Bridgewater Causeway. Arthur benefited by his foreknowledge. The imputations of personal injustice or corruption were unfounded. What he gained, others did not lose, except by the common risks of a sale. Thus, the property of the Reverend Robert Knopwood, whom he was said to defraud, was several times in the market. It was offered by advertisement many years before. Its future appropriation to commerce was predicted and was described to enhance its price. It was offered by Mr. Knopwood to Mrs. Hodgson for £800. It was purchased by Mr. H. Jennings, a nephew of Mr. Gellibrand, Sr., without reference to Arthur, and was finally sold to his agent at a small advance. The new wharf rendered the purchase highly advantageous, but there was neither deceit nor oppression. The great work he began at Bridgewater, where a magnificent causeway forms the abutment of a bridge which connects both banks of the Derwent, was a task of many years. Many £1,000s in value lie buried. Arthur had estates in its vicinity. The other charges of corruption are of a similar nature, even less substantial than these. But although many of his works will perpetuate his memory while the country lasts, they could only be justified by their connection with penal arrangements. The discipline prescribed did not admit of rapid movement or wide distribution. Huts were necessary for the convicts, houses for their officers, and various stores, and it was only on extensive excavations that labour could be inspected with success. The waste of expenditure was rather apparent than real. The objects contemplated were not colonial, and thus, if the local obligation is lessened, the ground of complaint is diminished. During his government, Arthur became wealthy. His estates were numerous, and their sale realized a large amount. That he acquired them improperly is not even capable of suspicion. That he applied clandestinely the means afforded by his office to improve them is equally destitute of evidence. Nor is it easy to see how a community can be injured by the outlay of capital acquired in its service, or the interest of its officers in the soil. The moral weight of government was compromised far more by the air of mystery which veiled than the corruptions which debased it. The outcries raised against the disposal of land in special instances were often misdirected. Many deviations from strict impartiality were prescribed by the Secretary of State, whose discretion was unlimited by regulations. Arthur was silent, and his character suffered. He despised reproach, which notwithstanding impaired his influence for good. Just before his recall, Mr. William Bryan made statements before the Commons of misappropriation of Crown lands, which had been the text of colonial articles without number. When a secretary from the Colonial Office stated that the more serious were unfounded, that many were ministerial acts, and the whole series were reduced to comparative nothingness. While Arthur had the power, he was not sparing in its use. He endowed his friends. Nor is it incredible that a private service to himself detracted nothing from weight of public obligation. Arthur was no fickle or hesitating patron, and the qualities he approved are nearly allied to virtue. He appreciated humanity, sobriety, industrious habits, and religious decorum. Respectable men who did not question or cross his path might usually calculate on his complaisance. But those who reckoned up his estates, numbered the benefits conferred on his friends, estimated the cost of his government, or criticized his public works, found that he did not fear, although he detested them. The imperial officers cared not in what direction his patronage was turned, and their nominees experienced and praised his generous discretion. The impressions of devout men were usually favorable to Arthur. He told them his objects and trials with apparent humility and devotion. He listened with deep attention to their plans of usefulness and talked, especially of the prisoners, in strains of Christian compassion. His sanction was given to every benevolent scheme, and he gathered around him a very large proportion of those persons who care more for the circulation of religious knowledge than the civil enfranchisement of mankind. The ready countenance of their labours lessened, in their view, his civil faults. Nor can it be denied that the decorous habits of the governor confirmed his religious pretensions. Wherever he appeared, ribaldry and drunkenness vanished. The open licentiousness of public officers he did not tolerate, except the offenders were distinguished by official cleverness. Addresses from all denominations of Christians expressed their admiration of his religious sympathies and his moral worth. And in the most bitter outburst of party spirit, his domestic character was never assailed. The testimony of Messrs. Backhouse and Walker, members of the Society of Friends, would generally be adopted by most persons of their class. Our first interview with Colonel Arthur gave us a favourable impression of his character as a governor and a Christian, which further acquaintance with him strongly confirmed. He took great interest in the temporal and spiritual prosperity of the colonists, and the reformation of the prisoner population, as well as in the welfare of the black inhabitants. Messrs. Backhouse and Walker were authorized by the Society of Friends and sent on a religious mission to these colonies. They brought a letter of introduction from the Secretary of State, Lord Goderich, requesting the governor to forward their benevolent object. The more violent opponents of Arthur, connected with the press, afterwards retracted their opinions. But their statements must be read with equal caution, whether they censure or praise. A collection was made by Arthur's friends in token of their regard, supposed to exceed £1,000 in value. It, however, indicated rather their liberality than their number. Individual contributions were not limited. The addresses were signed by many who were conciliated by his moral sentiments but disapproved of his government. They, however, seemed to justify the ministerial applause which crowned his administration. Sir George Grey referred to these tokens of esteem as evidence of popularity and the contentment of the people. Arthur held his last levee on the afternoon of his departure. Several hundreds were present, collected from all parts of his government. He proceeded with the chief officers, civil and military, to the beach, where the 21st Fusiliers awaited him. Multitudes attended his progress. The wharf was crowded with spectators. 100 boats surrounded the government barge and followed him to the ship. The vessels in the harbour were decorated, and his numerous friends gave the usual demonstrations of favour. In these feelings, many did not participate. Some followed him with hisses and groans. Others illuminated their houses in token of joy. Some fell into the hands of the police, overpowered by their excessive gladness. Having gone through the ceremony of embarkation, he returned to his office and spent the night in completing his last labours. Adverse winds detained the vessel, and he passed the Sabbath in sight of that country where his name can never be forgotten. and where monuments more durable than brass, formed by his care, will remain to the end of time. The manners of Arthur were formal, his tastes moral, his temper vindictive. He approved the right and usually followed it. But his resolution once taken, he did not hesitate. He devoted all who opposed him, and those whom he could not conciliate, if possible, he bore down. The sentiment of religion, however, did sometimes triumph over his antipathies. His contest with Mr. Gellibrand, the barrister, continued many years, but they met at the sacrament shortly before their final separation. Arthur approached the seat where Gellibrand was sitting and offered his hand. This being misunderstood, a prayer book was tendered him. He then explained that before they joined in the solemnity which had brought them there, he was anxious for reconciliation. Such only who know little of man and of those conflicting passions which attain alternate ascendancy in the human breast will survey with distrust a scene like this. In the presence of the Almighty, the loftiest mind may bend without meanness and recognize the moral grandeur of a forgiving spirit. A few months after the departure of Arthur, Mr. Joseph Tice Gellibrand lost his life. He visited Port Phillip, a place which long engaged his thoughts. In company with Mr. Hesse, a barrister, he set out to explore the interior. They missed their way. The guide who attended them was convinced of danger. He could not prevail on them to change their route, and he returned alone. Their long absence occasioned anxiety, and parties of their friends attempted to track them. They found that when in company with the guide, they had crossed the Byron instead of the Lee, their intended course. They then travelled on about 15 miles by the riverside and over a plain, and entered a wood soon impervious to horsemen. Then their track was lost. For several years, efforts were made to solve the mystery of their fate. In 1844, the natives directed Mr. Allen, a gentleman of credit, to a spot where they stated a white man had been murdered. There he discovered human bones, but no evidence by which identity could be established. Beyond this, nothing certain is known. On his return to Great Britain, Arthur was received with favour by the ministers. He was created a knight and appointed governor of Upper Canada. Afterwards, he obtained a similar office in India. Sir George Arthur cannot be withdrawn from the rank of eminent functionaries, and his administration, on the whole, is entitled to more than respectful remembrance. End of chapter 28 being chapter 3 from 1824 to 1836, section 17.